For a lot of people, it's been a relief not to have to hear about and from the former president. But while the man is long gone from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the damage he did and the weaknesses he exploited remain. So forgive this detour back into the Trump era, but as a new project from the Boston Globe editorial board argues, the longer he escapes consequences, the weaker American democracy becomes for the next, quote, would-be dictator or Trump himself if he wins in 2024. The project is called Future-Proofing the Presidency, and in it, the editorial board lays out the ways he flouted democracy and what guardrails need to be constructed to protect it, writing, by making an example of Trump and holding him accountable, the country can protect itself against future and potentially far more devastating presidential corruption and misconduct. The nation can and must prevent the rise of an American tyrant. I'm joined now by Globe editorial page editor Bina Venkataraman. Bina, welcome and congratulations. It's quite a piece of work.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. Was there one thing that inspired this project now in particular?
Well, it's really the records of the past 4 years, what we've seen. I think now that we have a little bit of distance from the Trump presidency and people are really, would like to forget this chapter of our history, it's more important than ever that we do what we can to keep our democracy, that we recognize that what Donald Trump did is not just these specific abuses of power, but really leaving a treasure map for future corrupt leaders to exploit. And unless we shore it up, really exposing that our institutions are not capable of checking against those abuses of power.
So let's go through 5 different areas of the treasure map, one by one if we can. First, and these are your words, who owns the president? Now, here are 2 of the subheads from you. Requiring future presidents to divest themselves of their businesses and other assets. Require future presidents to publicly release their tax returns. Everybody, I assume, knows that releasing your tax returns was the norm, not a law, a norm violated by Trump. But as you mentioned in your own editorial, the New York Times essentially released his tax returns, and 74 million people didn't give a damn. So why even go to the trouble?
Well, think about the timing of that. There was a stage in the Republican primaries leading up to 2016 where, had you known that President Trump was hundreds of millions of dollars in debt, you might have seen his opponents in the Republican Party use that as ammunition against him, because this narrative that he was a successful businessman was part of the Trump persona, right?
True.
It was part of why he appealed to his base. So I think there's something to that. I'm not saying it's going to solve all the problems, but certainly it would do a lot more in the way of giving transparency to those voters who do care.
And not a radical solution, since every Republican and Democratic president for quite a while have done it. Let's move on to a sordid family affair, making anti-nepotism laws apply to both the president and vice president. It's unclear whether they do or not. You want to make that certain. Obviously, we're talking in this case, obviously historically, Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, absolutely no experience, but it's less about them and more, I assume, about people related to the president having greater loyalty to him or her than to the country, yes?
It's about that, and also about using the office of the presidency to enrich the family of the presidency, which we know actually happened in the case of Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner on multiple occasions.
To the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars during these 4 years, am I not right?
Absolutely. And, sort of more informal aspects of making sort of quid pro quo promises of visa access to companies that invested in their companies. Quite a lot of corruption and conflict of interest.
Hey, they got to feed the kids. What can I tell you? Let's move to the next area, which is a big one, hiding the evidence. And the sub-piece is strengthening whistleblower protections, strengthening congressional oversight, appoint a White House ethics czar. But I want to talk about the Department of Justice revisiting a policy so that a sitting president can be indicted. We know that the Office of Legal Counsel has a memorandum that says a sitting president can't be indicted. It's not a law. And obviously, it's what caused Robert Mueller to meekly end his report, laying out serious case of obstruction of justice, but doing absolutely nothing about it. This one could be done with a stroke of the pen by the Department of Justice, correct?
Absolutely. And that policy dating back to the 1970s does not need to be the law of the land. It is merely, justified by the fact that of not wanting to create a spectacle of having a president on trial. The board's position is that you don't need to have a full trial of a president, but indicting a president based on criminal charges, as could have been done from the Mueller investigation, the obstruction of justice, into the investigation into the Trump campaign's ties to Russian interference in the 2016 election, that could at least be a deterrent from presidents that are using the office to commit crimes.
Is there any indication that Joe Biden or his Merrick Garland, his attorney general, have any intention of doing this?
We hope so. I don't think there's been an official statement from the Biden administration on this yet, but we hope our board's position will help inform a sane policy.
When people are reading your thing, before we get to the next area, this again is an area that unilaterally can be done by an attorney general, obviously, the Department of Justice. Much of the rest of what's on your list, what we talked about so far in particular, requires some level of bipartisanship, which we don't have, sort of ironically, because of the tyrant who inspired your project, creating such fear in his followers. So is there a little bit of wheel spinning, do you worry, in your proposals that require legislative action?
These proposals, while they are weaknesses that have been exposed by Donald Trump, need not be political. These are really proposals that are about building on what the founders of American democracy did. And we know what we found to be not strong enough to withhold and withstand against a corrupt leader in the White House. Now, the next tyrant, the next would-be dictator who wants to seize control and cause an insurrection in the White House could be a Democrat. So these reforms really ought to have bipartisan support. Now, will they have bipartisan support in the wake of the Trump presidency, or will people look at them as specific reforms, directed just at one president? It's unclear, but that's one of the reasons we frame this project as being about future-proofing the presidency. This is about a new sort of foundational thinking about what can protect the integrity of our democracy.
I want to skip over the next area, but I'm at least going to mention rewards for doing the president's bidding, establish transparent clemency board through executive order, constitutional amendment constraining the pardon power, which is obviously one of the broadest powers any president has. Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, Michael Flynn, et cetera. Again, this would very, very briefly just narrow that power so that who could not be the recipient of a pardon if your amendment were to happen?
That's right. The idea would be you don't want the president's close family members, his top aides, his top advisors. You don't want the vice president. You don't want his campaign chair being eligible for pardon, because it makes it prone to using that office to pardon people who commit crimes on behalf of the president. Okay,
so let's talk about the one that is specifically about Donald Trump, the case for prosecuting Trump. And you list three areas that you believe are prosecutable: repeated attempts to obstruct justice, a la the Mueller report, efforts to overturn the Georgia election results, and incitement of the insurrection on January 6th. I want to play for you. Jack Goldsmith was here, who interestingly was head of that Office of Legal Counsel years ago. He co-wrote a book with a former counsel to Barack Obama, Bob Bauer. It's called After Trump, Reconstructing the Trump Presidency, sort of a variation on what you did. He makes one of the cases against prosecuting. This is Goldsmith, against prosecuting Donald Trump. Here he is.
The process of doing that would be novel in American history. One administration investigating the acts of a prior one for criminality. I think it would maintain the circus that's been going on in Washington and make it hard for the Justice Department to kind of move forward with the appearance of independence and impartiality.
Where's Jack Goldsmith wrong, Bina?
What's novel in American history is having a president sitting in the White House trying to incite an insurrection, trying to seize power illegally and overturn the results of a Democratic election in Georgia by calling up the Secretary of State and asking him to find votes. That is unprecedented in American history. So he's absolutely right on that front. I just draw a different conclusion. The board draws a different conclusion, which is that because this is unprecedented, it is so clear it has crossed a line. And if we don't do anything about it, if Donald Trump gets away with having broken the law from the White House, having committed these crimes, we are sending a message to any would-be inhabitants of the White House that they are above the law, that they are able to commit such crimes, that they are able to even destroy our democracy and not face consequences.
Why isn't impeachment enough, though? The Constitution has a provision. The fact that the Senate chose not to convict is their business. They're entitled to reach that decision. Why do you need a prosecution when you have a constitutional power that actually was used twice by this Congress, that Congress?
Absolutely true. I mean, I think part of what we've seen from Congress's failure to remove, from the Senate's failure to remove the president for both of his impeachments, is that tool is actually weaker than the founders thought. It's weaker than we thought, because if you have a president and if you have a political party in power in the Senate that is above reproach, above, basically inured to shame and the principles of our democracy, that tool doesn't actually quite work because it's a political process. Impeachment is a political process. And you would hope that a prosecution with a fair trial, which should be an apolitical trial, an impartial trial, a trial based on evidence, could draw conclusions and actually be a better deterrent to future abuses of power.
So before you go, can I take liberty, since I have the editorial page editor right here, can I file a verbal letter to the editor in response to your project? Is that okay with you?
Sure, why not? Let's hear it.
The letter would say something like, the only thing worse than a tyrant in the presidency is a tyrant who suffers from serious mental illness. I am not a shrink, but as you know, there was a book written by 27 psychiatrists and others early on in the presidency talking about the dangerous case of Donald Trump, people who think he does suffer from mental illness. I would make the case that a guy who says he's going to return to power in August is not just a demagogue, but somebody who's got more serious problems. Just like the tax return norm, we used to have at least medical analyses or examinations of major party candidates. How about medical and psychological analysis of not only major party candidates, but presidents of the United States every year, every 2 years, done by independent entities, which then report, without violating privacy rights, their basic findings to the American people?
Well, it's an interesting idea, but you presume that the delusions are not just manufactured in order to rile people up, that they actually exist in the person's mind, which might be the case.
It
Remember,
might be.
This debate kind of came up on the evening of January 6th, as you'll remember, when people were debating about whether to use the 25th Amendment, whether some of President Trump's cabinet could remove him, calling him mentally unfit because of what he'd done. But it's really hard to make the argument that he had any kind of real, actual mental illness driving him to do that, rather than just a craven desire to stay in power and possibly to not have to pay off his hundreds of millions of dollars in debt.
I only have 30 seconds. I want to, rather than debate whether I'm right or wrong about Trump, there could be a tyrant in that office going forward who did suffer from serious mental illness, and there's no way to assess it. So going forward, doesn't it make sense that there be some transparency there? Quickly, if you can.
Well, I think there's a case to be made about medical records being disclosed, about being honest about those, capacities. I don't think there's even a norm for that right now. And, it does get you into a little bit of murky terrain because, if people start disclosing their medical records, if they have a heart condition, should they be disqualified from, running the White House? And, I think probably the answer to this is to let the public know. The public should have more information, but whether any of these things should be automatically disqualifying as medical conditions, I just think that we want to be careful about what precedent we would set for holding public office.
By the way, my whole life is spent in murky terrain, so that's not an obstacle for me. Bina Venkataraman, congratulations to you and your colleagues. It's a really worthwhile and important project.
Thanks so much, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.